Sometimes you just need to practice things a little bit wrong in order to get them right. And if that's confusing to you, don't worry, I'm gonna explain it right now. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So obviously this idea of practicing things wrong to get them right is a little bit of a overdone concept, but basically what I'm talking about is the final result that we want to get in our practice and sort of like intermediary steps in between. So sometimes we have more of a practice stage where we practice things in a way that we don't really want them to ultimately sound, or we won't ultimately play exactly like that. But these are ways to help us get something to sound the way we want it to, or actually to be physically moving in such a way as to accomplish the musical tasks at hand. And I have several examples for you today. So the first example is using staccato, or practicing things staccato, to sort of learn to release the fingers. So oftentimes when we play something, we have a tendency for the fingers to get stuck in a position, okay? So if I'm practicing or playing a scale, my fingers are a little bit stiff. You can see that they're not fully releasing. And when I say releasing, I mean after I play a key, the finger totally releases. Okay? So as I play to my fifth finger, you can see that these fingers are just along for the ride. They're not doing anything. They're sort of like passengers in a bus. They're not working to push the bus or move the bus in any way, okay? So what am I talking about? Practicing staccato in order to get that. So what I'm talking about here is more of a wrist staccato, okay? But really, if I have some sort of scalar passage, okay, and I'm just gonna use let's say a G major scale for this, instead of playing the way I want it to ultimately sound, what I'm going to do is I'm going to practice it staccato with a wrist staccato, okay? That's important to understand here, so not a finger staccato. But I'm going to practice it in that way because I want to really learn to release my fingers. So for instance, I play my thumb and everything releases. And I play my second finger and everything releases. And then, ultimately, that helps me sort of get that in to that, okay? So, of course, we don't want it to sound staccato eventually, but this can help to get that scale to sound smoother and be less tiresome and cumbersome when we're playing, because the fingers will actually be releasing after we play them instead of staying a little bit tense and sort of rigid, okay? Now, the next example that I have is using circular gestures or motions. So what I'm talking about here is kind of making a circular shape with the hand and the arm like so, okay? And this is, you know, pretty common. We've talked about this before, but this is pretty common in sort of like arpeggiated figures. So you can see that I'm sort of circling over and under, okay? And just one octave, it would look like this. Now this is partly when we have passages where we have these changes of direction. So something goes up the keyboard and down, and then up and then down, sort of like that. Or if I had something like that. Okay, so that's some sort of broken chord. Or even sometimes if I have some sort of scalar thing, I can use a little bit of a circle because those changes of direction can be helpful. But most of the time we don't really want to use a big circle when we play a scale, okay? We want to just go straight up the keyboard, okay? Now, at the top of the scale, and this is always a problem, or the bottom of the scale in the left hand, okay, and I'm going to use the left hand for this. It's important that the arm is really traveling with the hand. Okay, and sometimes it's hard for students to get the arm really all the way there, so the elbow is actually behind that fifth finger. And so sometimes it can be helpful to say, okay, well, what you're going to do is you're going to circle at the bottom, or in the right hand, of course, which you can't see super well, I'm going to circle at the top. And the whole point of that is to get the elbow moving behind the hand. If I do this, it's easy for the elbow is behind my thumb. It's not really behind my fifth finger. If I add that circle, you can see I kind of have to swing it around, or it's easier to make sure that it's swinging around. Now, when we're playing scales really fast, we don't have time for those kind of movements, but the whole point of that is to get the elbow and arm moving with the hand so that the arm is really behind each finger as we play, especially at those extreme ranges of register, okay? So that's actually super helpful, and ultimately we don't, again, want to do that, but it can have a really great effect. And then eventually we can, just like the staccato practice, we can just get rid of it, and we're left behind with good habits of movement, okay? Now, the next example we're going to talk about is arpeggios. So sometimes people teach arpeggios where you connect the third finger to the thumb like this and sort of like swing the arm out. And that's fine for a slow tempo. I typically don't teach arpeggios quite like that. I have a series, I think, on arpeggios where I talk a little bit about this. But when we play arpeggios, what we want is we want to get the thumb as close as we can, to that destination note. But we don't want to try to connect it perfectly because we're going to have to do weird things in the wrist and the arm. And at speed, we don't really have time to do that, okay? So we're going to use a little bit of rotation here, okay? And I talk about rotation in other videos, okay? So what happens essentially, just real quick, is before this note has time to fully release, I've already played the next note. So there's no audible gap that we hear. But when I'm first teaching this kind of arpeggio technique, which is, we can call it a fast arpeggio technique if we like, I teach it without that thumb coming under. So the thumb would come under a little bit, okay? Now, I'm not trying to yank it under because that creates a lot of tension and awkwardness, but I want it to come under about behind the third finger. So, but I'm not going to teach that to students that I'm first teaching this because oftentimes arpeggios, we can focus so much on the thumb, we don't think about anything else. I remember when I was probably, 12 or 13 and I was learning, one hand, multiple octave arpeggios. My teacher told, the only thing she talked about is that thumb comes under and connects to, the next octave note, in this case C. She didn't talk about the elbow, the arm, she didn't say anything, just the thumb. So we have a tendency to focus so much on that thumb that nothing else matters. And this, of course, is a problem because there's so many other moving parts. What about my wrist? What about my elbow? Etc. Okay? So this can cause a lot of problems. So usually I'll have students do this, okay? We're going to really focus on the rotation. This also helps because then you can focus on one thing at a time, but we'll go rotation, and then just rotate back here, etc. Okay? So I'm not trying to get the thumb in there at all. Sort of like that. Now, again, you can see there's that huge ugly gap in there. The thumb is accented. That's not how we want it to sound. Absolutely. But this is really helpful because it takes the focus away from the thumb and it puts it on the arm and the gestures or the movement. So rotation, they can actually work that in. And the walking arm, let's say. So the arm is actually walking up the keyboard, okay? And we can do the same thing, where we add a circle at the top, okay? Again, eventually, we don't want to have that circle at the top when because again, this is sort of like our fast arpeggio technique, if you will. So we don't really want that circle in there, and we don't want the thumb accented, and we also want the thumb to come under enough to get that connection. But this is helpful in the intermediate stage. Now, why is this so important? Because sometimes we try to go from just learn something to the final result. But if we don't understand what all of those moving parts are, it's very easy to get stuck on something or kind of get a little bit lost along the way, or etc. So these three examples, I think, are really important to understand that it doesn't always have to sound exactly how you ultimately want it to sound, as long as you know, okay, that accented thumb, I want to get rid of that eventually. I do want the thumb to come under eventually, but I can't focus on that right now because those rotational movements are already so much to think about, if that's a new concept, that I'm going to struggle. So you want your practice to be efficient and effective, and you don't want to try to overload yourself too much. And at the same time, even if you know you need to do something, right? Like let's say release the fingers when you play scales, it's virtually impossible to do that if you're practicing fast, okay? So finding a good way to practice in something, okay, and even if it's in a piece of music, not just a scale or an arpeggio, you can still do this, of course, but finding a way to practice that in to get the end result that you want, even if that intermediary practice stage is ultimately not what you want, but having the end goal in mind. And I think that this is an incredibly important idea, and especially for anyone who is struggling with different aspects of piano technique, you want to look at what you're trying to accomplish long and hard and think, what are the problems? How can I accomplish those problems, with some sort of intermediary practice technique? If you have any questions, make sure and put those down below. I hope this was interesting and informative. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.